Okay. So in this little picture here, let's take a look at it. In this picture here, you see a 3 by 3 matrix, okay? Matrix array, right? You have 9, in this case, detector cells, okay? Each one of them is going to receive some amount of exposure, either 0 or a lot, but some amount of exposure to X-rays or light. And so each one of them is going to each store a different amount of electric charge, okay? And when each one is asked, how much charge do you have, each one is going to answer, okay? They store the charge in the capacitor. When they're asked, how much charge do you have, okay, the thin film transistor turns on and gives an answer, turns on and sends the charge to the computer. The array of DEC cells is crisscrossed with wires called gate lines and data lines. These gate lines and data lines, to make it less complicated, as little complication as I can, basically just ask each DEC cell one at a time, what's your charge, okay? And each one of them answers, all right? Each one of them gets a charge from exposure, and each one of them is asked, how much charge do you have, okay? Don't worry about gate lines being controlled by address drivers, which controls the order in which the DEC cells are read out. Just know that each one of them is asked one at a time, what's your charge, okay? And it's gonna go through row by row. Top left one, right? And the one over from it, and the one over from that. Do the whole top row, okay? Then it's gonna go down a row. Do the whole second row, okay? The computer, because of the way this is arranged, the computer knows when it receives the first, in this case, I'm just giving an example, when it receives the first signal, it knows that signal came from the top left DEC cell, okay? So the computer stores as a part of the file how much current it received. That's going to be the gray scale, the amount of gray that DEC cell will show, okay? And the computer knows where in space that DEC cell lives. In this case, top left, okay? So now when this image is displayed on the computer, the top left pixel on the screen will have the shade of gray that top left DEC cell would have, equivalent to what that top left DEC cell would have received in radiation, okay? Then it goes to the one over from that, and the computer knows the first one is this one, the second one is the one adjacent to it in that same row, okay? So it's going to put in the second over pixel on the computer screen whatever amount of grayscale is equivalent to the amount of exposure this cell received, okay? Just goes one by one by one, row by row by row. Does one row, then the next row, then the next row, and the computer remembers where each of these are in space, okay? So because it controls the order in which the DEC cells read out, it knows when it receives a signal, which DEC cell it's coming from, okay? So when it has to reproduce the picture, right, it's going to remember where everything's at, okay? Okay, that is as simply as we can say it, the way the DEC cells are read out. Each one receives a current, each one charges, each one waits until it's asked, how much charge do you have, and then it answers. And the computer records that answer. Each cell, the exposure from each cell is going to be stored as a separate computer file. Okay? All right. Every little square will be a separate computer file. Yep. The picture is going to be made up of, thousands of computer files. Yep. Okay. Okay, let me backtrack just a little bit here. So these detector surfaces, right? These detector surfaces shown in green are sensitive to X-rays or visible light, depending on which material the manufacturer decided to use, okay? If the detector surface is sensitive to X-rays, then when X-rays strike it, it converts the X-ray energy into electricity, okay? That's called direct conversion, DR. We have DR with detector cells, and the X-rays are directly converted into electricity, There's no in between, okay? Semiconductor gets hit, electric current gets generated. However, before this this material came out, okay, we had what's called indirect conversion. Indirect conversion is, as it sounds, a little bit indirect, okay? We used x-rays, they passed through the patient, they hit the image receptor, but then we took the x-rays and changed them into visible light. The visible light is what exposes the detector surface. This is called indirect conversion because we go through one extra step, converting x-rays into visible light first, okay? There are advantages and disadvantages to both. Both types are still out in use, and so let's explain how indirect conversion works. Indirect conversion, developed before direct conversion, uses silicon rather than selenium. These are two different materials. Silicon generates electric charge when visible light hits it. Selenium generates electric charge when X-rays hit it. And, you know, the material is what's important. Silicon, selenium. The word amorphous just means non-crystalline or otherwise a powder. These semiconductor materials are powdered form, then they're laid onto the detector cell, the DEC cell, and they're effectively locked in place. But so the fact that they're amorphous is not a big important thing, but it's part of the word. So in the indirect conversion system, the entire AMA, active matrix array, the entire grid of DEC cells has laid on top of it something called a scintillator. Okay? This is what converts X-rays into visible light. It can be called a phosphor screen or scintillating layer or scintillator. It converts X-rays into visible light. Because with indirect, which again was first, and why you ask, why would we go through all these steps? Why can't we just convert X-rays into electricity, right? We definitely can. It's just that the first way we figured out how to do this was to convert X-rays into light and then light into electricity, okay? So the old way, indirect, still exists because it has added advantages. So I'll explain those advantages. Like if we had an old way of doing something, right? And then we develop a new way of doing something, and the new way is better in all ways, in all possible ways, then we're just going to use the new way of doing something, right? But if we had an old way of doing something and a new way of doing something, but the old way still had advantages, then we're probably still going to keep using the old way, right? And use them both, yeah? You know, in different circumstances, right? You know, gas cars came first. Electric cars are coming out now, right? Are there still gas cars on the road? Why? Why don't we all drive electric cars? They're expensive. Can I go to the gas station and fill up my electric car with electricity? I can go to a charging station, but it takes me like, you know, whatever, an hour, whatever, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours to charge, right? There are advantages to the electric car. They're kind of fast, right? Kind of quiet, right? They, you know, they are a little more advanced in their technologies, right? But then there's huge disadvantages. They have short ranges, yeah? They catch on fire. You got to replace the big battery packs every 10 years or whatever, right? So there are disadvantages. We still use both because there are still advantages to gas cars that electric cars don't have, okay? And the electric cars have advantages the gas cars don't have. We still use indirect and direct conversion because direct is newer, indirect is older, but indirect has advantages over direct conversion, okay? So there's good and bad for each, okay? So both are still in use. Okay, so you should remember silicon converts light into electricity. Selenium converts X-rays into electricity. So if you want to make a detector out of silicon, but you want to use it in an X-ray room, you have to convert the X-rays into visible light first. Indirectly converting, okay? We're not directly converting things to electricity, we're doing an indirect conversion. For indirect conversion, converting X-rays to visible light requires a layer over the whole thing, a layer of something called a scintillator. These scintillators are made of one of two materials: cesium iodide or gadolinium oxysulfide. You don't need to know what gadolinium oxysulfide is, okay? You will when we do physics, okay? Don't worry about it. It's gadolinium oxysulfide, right? That's all you need, right? It probably has something to do with gadolinium, and it probably has something to do with oxygen and sulfur, right? Okay. Cesium probably has something to do with cesium, right? Okay, so they are materials that have the property that when X-rays strike them, they shine bright with light, okay? In other words, they convert X-rays into visible light. Both of these, cesium iodide and gadolinium oxysulfide, convert X-rays to visible light. This shouldn't actually be a big surprise, and it might be to some of you guys, but this shouldn't be a big surprise because for the longest time with film radiography, I don't know if you know this, but with film, X-rays don't expose film. Like this film here, X-rays don't expose it. Okay, this film in film radiography is exposed by visible light. Okay. When I showed you earlier the picture of Röntgen's wife's hand, how long did I say the exposure lasted for? 4 minutes, right? It's a long time, right? What's the longest exposure we've made in the X-ray room? 1 second, 2 seconds. My X-ray machine can go up to like 6 seconds of exposure, okay? It takes minutes, in principle, to expose photographic film without using X-rays, okay? Patients can't sit still for that long, okay? So very, very long ago, when we first started doing this, we learned that, and so inside of the, do I have the old cassette here? No, I'm not gonna go grab it, but old cassettes used to just be like a piece of like cardboard. Okay, that was it, just a big black covering of cardboard. You put a piece of film inside of the cardboard and you went to take your X-rays, okay? But very quickly, we realized that it takes a lot of X-ray exposure to expose photographic film. Photographic film responds better to visible light, okay? So inside of cassettes, any modern film cassette, modern meaning like, 60s, 70s and on, right? Any modern film cassettes all have these white screens on the inside of them, okay? These are called intensifying screens. What happens is the film goes inside of here, and the screen sits on either side of the film, and this whole thing sandwiches shut, okay? When X-rays strike here, come through the cover, pass through the cover, X-rays hit both this layer of screen and this layer of screen, and they shine a light. When X-rays hit the screen, it emits visible light, okay? So what's actually exposing the film inside of here is the visible light coming off of the intensifying screens. We've always been converting X-rays to visible light to expose our imaging plates, even when they were filmed, okay? It's just that this indirect conversion is now converting X-rays to visible light to electricity instead of exposing a piece of film. So we've been using conversions from X-rays to visible light since pretty much the beginning. Sorry? This is indirect DR. So for DR, the kind with the deck cells that we've been talking about, there's direct and indirect. Direct is easy. It's just X-rays turn into electricity, okay? That uses selenium to do that. The detector surface is made of selenium. We convert X-rays directly to electricity. If instead they've used silicon, which was the first kind to be created, to be discovered, we needed to convert X-rays to visible light to electricity, indirectly converting X-rays to electricity. There's an in-between step, right? Cesium iodide or gadolinium oxysulfide, both of these, either one, will convert X-rays to visible light. Then the visible light exposes the semiconductors, exposes the deck cells. So here's a quick little picture of how this kind of works, right? From top to bottom, you have X-rays come in. X-rays hit these crystals. Now, so cesium iodide, gadolinium oxysulfide are in the form of crystals, okay? Microscopic crystals, let me show you briefly. Microscopic crystals, tiny crystals, but crystals, okay? So these crystals are all formed, they're all set in columns, just like it shows here, all in columns, sitting on top of the detector. So we're not looking at it from left to right, top, bottom. We're looking at it like as a cross section right now, okay? X-rays coming in from the top, hitting the scintillator surface, and light spreading out from the surface down to the detector. Okay, we're looking top to bottom now, cross section. So X-rays come in, strike the scintillator surface, and X-rays convert to visible light in the scintillator. Visible light continues downward and strikes the detector surface, strikes the silicon detector surface. The silicon, when it's hit by visible light, generates electric current. That current is stored in the capacitor in the bottom corner. And then when the capacitor is asked how much current did you store by the computer, the thin film transistor switches and answers the computer's question. Now, some things that we know about visible light and all forms of light, including X-rays, they like to spread out. Okay, light, when you turn on a light bulb, the light likes to spread out, right? So when a single X-ray photon strikes the crystals and it converts X-ray light to visible light, there's a spreading effect of the light. That spreading effect decreases the spatial resolution. That spreading effect of the light in indirect conversion loses us some detail. Okay? So indirect conversion has poorer spatial resolution than direct conversion. Yeah, so indirect conversion has poorer, worse spatial resolution than direct conversion does. But this was the first one to come out, right? You would expect newer stuff to have better resolution. This has poorer spatial resolution. So you might go, well, why are we still using it if the resolution's worse than with direct conversion? So no, unfortunately, this is any loss of spatial resolution here is not repairable in the computer. So these truly do have worse spatial resolution than direct conversions do, okay? The advantage is you can make the exposure with less radiation, meaning that you save the patient some radiation dose while sacrificing image quality. And we're not talking about like a very blurry out of focus image versus a very sharp image, right? We're talking about tiny changes in spatial resolution, tiny changes. So you sacrifice a small amount of image detail to save the patient some exposure.
And that's for indirect.
Indirect.
So indirect saves.
This is why indirect is still around, is because it saves the patient some exposure and it's a little cheaper.
Okay.
Ours is an indirect conversion system. Ours takes X-rays, converts to visible light exposes the detector cells. Now, this is all microscopic. This is, this little bar here is 4 micrometers across. Okay, so 4 millionths of a meter across. It's 4 thousandths of a millimeter across. It's teeny tiny, okay? They have to use a special microscope to even show you the crystals to begin with, okay? They're itty bitty. So we can say, although vertical crystals form light channels that confine the lateral dispersion of the light somewhat, the final resolution achieved is still not as good as with direct conversion. So again, we're sacrificing some spatial resolution for cost savings and patient exposure savings. So let's say that again in a different way, comparing them. Comparing, direct conversion produces higher spatial resolution because there is no spreading of light. X-rays just hit the detector. Indirect conversion lowers patient dose because there is an amplifying effect, okay? So let's say an X-ray photon has 20 times the energy of a visible light photon. When that X-ray photon hits the scintillating layer, that X-ray photon, a single X-ray photon, is going to turn into 20 visible light photons, okay? So there is a amplifying effect. X-rays have this is why X-rays are harmful, because they have more energy than visible light, okay? X-rays have more energy than visible light, so if an X-ray photon with a lot of energy converts into visible light, it's going to convert into a lot of visible light photons, meaning that you're going to have many, many, many more photons to work with, okay? You can make the exposure to the detector with less radiation. So you can lower your patient's dose. You can use less radiation than with direct conversion. You know, higher spatial resolution is good, like good image quality, right? We want good image quality because that's going to allow the diagnosing physician and the radiologist to see pathologies more easily, okay? So it's good, right? We want good spatial resolution because now we can diagnose disease more easily, okay? But it's also good to give patients less radiation, right? If you lower the radiation to patients in general, you're lowering the amount of radiation a patient receives in any given amount of time, a year, let's say. Did you guys know that a little more than half of the amount of radiation you will receive in a year on average comes from medical radiation? About half of the radiation you receive comes from your natural background, just the world around you, rocks and trees and your own body and the earth and the sun and the stars, all of that, okay? About half of it, about 49-ish%. About 51% of the radiation you will receive on average comes from medical radiation, X-rays mostly, okay? Now, if you didn't get an X-ray last year, then fine, but on average, last year, everyone's going to get some X-rays done, okay? If you spread it across the whole population, and about half of the radiation to an average person comes from medical stuff. So, if we can lower the amount of radiation being used on the medical side of things, then we can decrease the amount of overall radiation people are exposed to. Can't decrease your radiation exposure to your environment because you live in your environment, right? But you can decrease the amount of medical radiation used. So, assuming we have to take an X-ray on somebody, it's better to have something that uses less patient dose, that gives the patient less of a dose and gives them more. But it's also useful to have high spatial resolution. So we have to choose. An office buying a new piece of equipment would have to decide, do I want direct conversion, sacrificing patient exposure to gain detail, or do I want indirect conversion, save me some money, lose a little bit of detail, and a little bit less patient dose? And honestly, you know what the decision usually comes down to? What do you think the offices are usually going to worry more about, patient dose or how much it costs? Yeah, it's cost, right? It just happens to be that it saves the patient a little bit of dose, but it's honestly mostly down to cost, okay? Direct conversion's just a little more expensive. So it's good. Both are good, though. Both systems are still in use. Kind of like electric and gas cars are still in use, and they both have good and bad. All right. Let's move on now. Let's talk about computed radiography, or CR. Just all of this was about DR, the most modern kind. most commonly, I don't want to say most commonly, pretty commonly used now, okay? Another option is CR, computed radiography. So as I showed earlier, with film, again, there's a literal piece of film inside the cassette jacket. That piece of film is a new one for every image, okay? CR, as we showed earlier, uses a plate like that. That plate is exposed. That plate is not connected directly to anything, right? No batteries, no wires, no direct connection to anything. And the plate is reusable, okay? So it's similar to film in that it's a plate that captures X-ray information about the patient. It is different in that it's reusable and produces a digital image on the computer, okay? So this has some similarities to film, some similarities to DR. So let's talk about this thing called CR, or computed radiography. So if you have to take your cassette to a processor each time you make an X-ray, each time you produce an image, you have CR. Okay. CR was designed to be used the same as screen cassettes were. Okay. You notice they're like identical in shape and size, right? They kind of function very similarly, right? They have somewhat similar construction. However, they use something called an active phosphor layer that we're going to talk about, supported by a firm base made of aluminum. So for CR, we need to learn like what the material is, right? 'Cause we just did that for DR. What's the material? How does it work? So we're gonna do what the material is, how it works. All right. So here you go. This is a cross section. So we took that piece of film. Now you're looking at it on the looking at it at the thin edge, right? And it has that thin little thickness of film has layers to it. Okay. Well, let's talk about these layers. We're gonna go from bottom up. Okay, so on here, this cross section, at the bottom is the base. The base is aluminum. This gives the thing some thickness, some heft to it, so it's not going to fall apart. So we start with a sheet of aluminum. On top of the sheet of aluminum is something called a reflective layer. This lets any light traveling that is because X-rays are going to come in on this screen with this cross section. X-rays come in from the top. So any X-rays that make it through all of these layers will hit the reflective layer and be reflected back. Okay. Yeah, back up. Reverses any light traveling backward. The anti-halo layer is this third layer up from the bottom. And I'll explain the processor in a little bit here, but it prevents the laser light, which is in the processor, from reaching the reflective layer. One property is each time this plate is exposed to X-rays, you have to take it to a processor, and the processor has to get the information off of the plate. Okay? The way it does this is by using a laser, and I will explain more in a little bit. Okay? The processor uses a laser.
Is the anti?
This is all of what we're looking at right now. Everything on this chunk right here
Is the layers in there?
is the layers of this. Okay, it's all held in this thin little thing. Okay, so these are all very, very thin layers of something, right? The back, this is labeled backside. I know you can't see it, but it's labeled backside right here. This back is aluminum. Layered on top of the aluminum are all of these layers that we're talking about right now. Okay, only one of them is going to be useful in actually storing information. Okay, that's going to be the phosphor layer. We'll get to that. But this plate, it sits inside of here. This plate is then drawn out of the cassette into a processor, and as it's drawn in and out of the processor, the way we get the information out of this is by using a laser. Okay, I'll explain the laser thing in a minute here, but when it says prevents the laser light from reaching the reflective layer, there's a laser involved in the reading of this plate. Okay, promise you I'll explain. Okay. Right here, just below the protective layer is the functional part of this plate, the thing that actually does the work. This is called the photostimulable phosphor layer. All of those words are important, and we'll unpack them in a moment here. Photostimulable phosphor layer. What I want you to think about right now is this is the layer that converts X-rays into visible light. The computer is going to read what's on that plate in visible light. Okay, so you're fine. It's going to read the information stored on here. That information comes out as visible light. We're going to talk about that. On top of that, very top of it, what keeps this phosphor layer from being damaged by my grubby little fingers touching it, right, is just a thin sheet of protection, okay, thin protective layer, okay, so that when I scratch this, I don't remove the phosphors, I don't remove the working layer off of here, okay. It is, by the way, this is not a usable plate anymore. This is why I've got my hands all over it, okay. Normally we don't put our hands all over these, okay. If we ever have to touch these, we generally wear gloves and just try to hold the corners very gently as we move it. You can see, I don't know how well you can see, but there's scratches on this plate, okay? As these plates get scratched over time, the phosphor, the working part of this, gets removed. And every time this plate goes in and out, and an image is brought up on screen, you see a big fat scratch running across your image. Because the detecting part of the plate gets scratched away over time. There are rollers that have to bring this thing in to the processor and out of the processor. It's pushed in and out of this plate thousands of times. All of that means that the protective layer and the usable phosphor layer will wear down over time. Okay, so these have a usable lifespan, a year or two in busy offices, right? These are good for maybe 3,000 to 5,000 exposures, and you may make 3,000 to 5,000 exposures easily on this plate over a year's time, even if you have a few of these. Okay, so these are, they have a usable life. Well, what's nice is this is easy to buy and replace, and you just put a new one in here. Okay, yes.
How do you know when to replace them?
Oh, really good question, because you're going to start to see some errors showing up on your images, scratch artifacts showing up on your images, ghost images showing up where the plate doesn't fully erase after the previous X-ray. So you start seeing signs that your plate's getting old. Yeah, and you tell the department manager, hey, plate number 1 or whatever, it's starting to show me some artifacts, starting to show me ghost images, and they'll order a new plate for you. Yeah, good. That's a good question. Thank you. Okay. So that's the plate itself. The cassette, the thing that the plates sit in, so getting our terminology right, this is your plate, this is your cassette. Plate, cassette. Okay, so the cassette itself has a front to it. The cassette made of aluminum or plastic. The front of it, though, it's important because we need the X-rays to pass right through the front of it to get to the plate, yeah? The plate is made of carbon fiber. Kind of cool. We use carbon fiber for lots of different things to save weight. Carbon fiber is a fiber made of carbon, right? Carbon is a really light element. It's number 6 on the periodic table. It's one of the lighter elements that we have. And so it has the property that it doesn't absorb much X-rays as they pass through it, okay? So it makes a nice face, a nice sheet on the front of it, of the cassette, that doesn't absorb the X-rays. The back panel on the cassette, thin sheet of lead foil to reduce back scattered radiation. Both the front and back panels of the CR cassette on the inside are lined with felt that minimizes the buildup of static electricity and cushions the plate from being scratched or jolted or otherwise damaged as it's transported around. Unlike film cassettes, these do not need to be light tight. The film cassette I showed you, when I close it, it snaps shut, right? But this one just the plate scoots in and out of the top. There's no real covering to prevent things from getting. There's a dust cover, but there's no light cover. So these plates don't need to be light tight, okay? Which is nice. We don't have to have a dark room, in other words. And that that was a huge part of the X-ray room, was our dark room, okay? Take up space. It has to have special light bulbs, special protocol for going in and out of it, making sure you're not in the middle of removing a piece of film and someone comes in like, hey, and opens the door and then ruins your exposure, right? There's all these things you have to consider. You have to have your chemicals, you have to be the right temperatures, your processor has to be checked every day. There's all these things that you have to think about with your darkroom. We don't have any of that anymore, okay, which is very nice. It's taken away a lot of the, fortunately in this case, a lot of the extra thought involved in doing radiography, right? We have less work to do now, which is always nice. Okay. The phosphor plate is called single emulsion. There's a detector only on one side. The phosphors are only on the front side. They're not also on the back side. That's what we mean by single emulsion. This is different from photographic film. In photographic film, there's detector stuff on both sides, but on CR plates, it's only on one side. Single emulsion. The layer that captures the X-rays, stores their energy, and then later emits that energy as visible light is called a photostimulable phosphor. And it's made of, because this is the section where we have to remember all the different chemicals that make up these detectors. This one is made of barium fluorohalide. That's the detector. That's the phosphor material. This material is special because when it's exposed to X-rays, it can capture and store the X-ray energy. Okay? Then later on, so this, you take this, it's inside the cassette, you make an exposure, it captures and stores the X-ray energy. Okay? Then you take that plate and put it into a processor. It goes into the processor. Okay? Inside the processor, using special lasers and mirrors, the X-ray energy is released from the plate as visible light. That visible light is captured and read by the computer, telling the computer what's on here. Okay? But it's got to happen that the X-rays have to be stored, the energy from the X-rays has to be stored on the plate, then the plate has to be brought to a processor. Okay? That means that the X-ray energy has to stick around. Okay? It can't just disappear, right? So it happens that this material, barium fluorohalide, has the property that when you expose it to X-rays, it can capture that energy and then re-release that energy when stimulated, okay, by a laser in this case. This is called stimulated phosphorescence. The ability to store the latent image over time and then release it when asked to. Okay. Okay. If you know, say it, but if you've been here for a while, you should know. What do we know about the law of conservation of energy? If you've been here for a while, you've heard me talk about that. Marco, tell me something about the law of conservation of energy.
Energy's not lost, it's still created.
So energy can't be lost, right? Energy can't be created from nothing, and energy can't be destroyed, which is kind of the same thing as saying lost, right? So energy doesn't come from nothing, and energy doesn't go away, disappear, okay? I'm going to make a big sound when I hit my hand on the table like that, right? That hurt my hand, right? And it made some sound that hit all of your ears. Where's the sound now? It's not gone. it has changed into different forms of energy. You all heard it, right? Well, your brain took those vibrations, converted them into electric current for you to perceive the sound, okay? There's a conversion of energy. The energy's not gone. Those sound waves traveled around to the walls in this room as well as to all of you. They vibrated the walls in this room a little bit, heated up the air in this room a little bit, heated up the walls in this room a little bit. Tiny, like imperceptible amounts, right? Because that's not a lot of energy here. But there is a conversion of energy. It was never lost. In principle, I can go track down every little vibration and bring it back, right? Again, not in practice, but in principle, okay? All of the energy from that still exists, okay, somewhere. It's just spread out now, okay? Energy isn't lost, it's conserved, okay? So, X-rays. This is one other important thing to learn about X-rays as we go through this stuff. X-rays are a form of energy. We said they're light, right? But light is a form of energy, okay? X-rays are a form of energy. And energy can never be destroyed, can't come from nothing, also can't be destroyed, but it can change forms, okay? Just like when I hit the table and made a sound, I got some pain signals in my hand, right? You guys all got some sound signals, right? The energy from that mechanical motion of me swinging my hand got converted into sound and heat and all kinds of other energies, right? Chemical energies, because part of the brain is neurochemical, right? So it got converted into all these other energies, right? Energy can be converted, but can't be lost, okay? X-rays are a form of energy. So, you have this phosphor plate, right? This phosphor plate sits on, one side of the patient, right? X-rays pass through the patient, hit the plate, okay? The X-rays are carrying energy that is going to deposit into the material, the barium fluorohalide. The X-rays strike that material, and that phosphor plate is going to grab onto that energy, okay, by converting it, okay? The X-rays are converted into something called potential energy. You guys know what potential energy is? You guys all took high school science. What's potential energy? Okay. Does my book have more energy here on the table or up here?
Up there.
Why? It's going to fall?
Or,
Yeah.
I thought you were gonna drop it.
You're right. It's going to fall. So, why does my book have more energy up here than down here? Because it's in a different position, right? It has more potential energy because it's in a different position, right? What's going to happen if I let go of my book? Right? What happens to all the potential energy when the book's on the table? It was up here, the book fell to the table, it converted it, right? All the energy was converted. Think about it like this, right? I hold this book up high, here, I let it go, it makes a sound, right? What happens if I hold the book up higher? More potential energy, a bigger sound, right? Okay. As I bring the book higher and higher and higher, I'm giving it more potential energy. Where does the energy come from? I'm putting more energy into this book as I lift it higher and higher, right? Where's that energy coming from?
Gravity.
Not gravity. Who's picking the book up, gravity or me? Me, right? I'm picking this book up, okay? I'm using the energy in my muscles. I'm converting glucose and oxygen into ATP, right? To hold this book up high, right? To make my muscles contract and hold this book up, right? If I hold this up for long enough, I'm going to run out of energy to hold this book up, okay? I had to put energy into this book to lift it up. The book falls, and as it falls, potential energy, its energy of position, is being converted into what? Say it louder. Kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion, right? As it falls, it's losing potential and gaining kinetic, right? If I just let it go, it's going to speed towards the tabletop, okay? Potential converts to kinetic, okay? Then when the book hits the table, it stops moving, right? So at the point when it hit the table, it had its maximum amount of kinetic energy and the least amount of potential energy. Okay, it was at its, in other words, it was at its fastest speed when it hit the table, right? The book hits the table and stops moving, yeah? Where's all that energy go?
In the tube.
Into the table. You heard the table like vibrate when I did. That's why I picked my computer up so I didn't jar my computer when I dropped the book, right? So it hits the table, vibrates the table, makes a bunch of sound. It was kind of loud, right? Made a louder sound the higher I held the book, right? Vibrated the table, vibrated all your eardrums, right? If I did this like a bunch of times and hit the table a bunch, I could feel the table and the table would be warm. Okay, I'm putting heat into the table, energy into the table, right? Okay, so that whole time I was taking energy and converting it from one form into another. Okay, converting potential to kinetic, right? Kinetic energy into other forms of kinetic energy, sound, the sound waves, the vibration and the sound in the room, hits your ears, gets converted into electrochemical signals, right? Energy continues to be converted, okay? So let's go back to X-rays, okay? X-rays are a form of energy. So the X-rays strike this plate and all their energy gets deposited into the plate, okay? The material, the phosphor material on here, is able to capture the X-ray energy and store it as a form of potential energy, energy of position, okay? The material in the plate, barium fluorohalide, as well as all other materials in the known universe are made of atoms, okay? Atoms consist of a dense nucleus consisting of positive electric charges, and orbiting around atoms are electrons consisting of a negative electric charge. X-ray photons can be absorbed by electrons, okay? As an electron, which is being shown, so we see like 4 atoms here, okay? This is just 4 atoms out of like bajillions of them in that plate, right? Okay, so as an electron here, which orbits around this nucleus, these are atoms, gets struck by an X-ray photon, it's going to be raised to a higher position, a higher amount of potential energy, a greater potential energy. The energy from the X-rays is converted into raising up the electron out of its atom, okay? It's kind of like me taking this book and raising it up off the table, okay? I had to put energy into the book, right? So I'm like the photon hitting the electron. I'm putting energy into the electron, raising it up out of its atom, okay? Now, as long as I stay right here, this book has all of its potential energy, okay? It's not until I release the book that I convert the energy again, right? So I put a bunch of energy into this book, and then as long as I hold it here, the energy's stored, okay? That's kind of like what's happening here. The X-ray photon is hitting this guy. This little guy hops out of the atom that it's in. Normally, if this were like you and me, that electron would just scoot off into nowhere. We don't care about it anymore, okay? But in these special materials, the electrons try to hop out of the atoms, and because of the structure, because of the molecular composition, because of the way those materials are put together, the electrons can't escape, okay? So they grab onto a bunch of X-ray energy, they absorb an X-ray photon, they try to escape from the atom that they're in, and they get stuck.
So like
Okay? They get trapped, and that is literally what the word is, right? They fall into an electron trap, okay? Also known as a Fabrizien center, okay? Or F center, okay? So it is an electron hole or an electron trap, okay? It traps the electron. Now the electron is basically like this book, right? Stuck up here, stuck with a bunch of potential energy, okay? And it's gonna hold on to it. Now, what's gonna happen if you just leave me here?
you're gonna get tired.
I'm eventually gonna get tired, right? And slowly and slowly and slowly and slowly, no matter how hard I try, right? No matter how strong I am, eventually I'm gonna run out of energy and the book gets back to the tabletop, okay? Eventually, if you never process this plate, that electron is going to find its way back into the atom, okay? But over short periods of time, hours or so, the book stays up, okay? The electron stays trapped, holding on to all of the X-ray that it had just absorbed, okay? So it's gonna hold on to that, hold on to that energy until we can get that plate to a processor that can release that energy, okay? And then let the book fall.
So it like keeps the image
Yeah,
there,
yeah, it keeps all the information of the latent image stuck.
invisible to
Invisible to you, right? But stuck there, stored in the plate.
right.
Mhm.
Okay.
All that energy is held on to because of the special construction of the phosphor material. Okay, so again, this is just 4 atoms out of bajillions of them, right? But you get the idea, right? An X-ray photon strikes it, electrons let loose, raised up out of the atom, and then it just gets stuck. Okay, it can't let it go, right? Stuck inside of that electron trap. So then you walk the plate over to a processor. You take the plate, stick it in the processor grabs the plate out of the cassette into the processor. Okay? As it grabs it and brings it into the processor, it's going to use a laser and it's going to start to hit each little spot on this plate with the laser. Okay? When the laser beam comes in and hits these atoms, okay, these electrons are going to absorb lasers are a form of light, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. It's going to absorb the X-ray laser energy, and it's going to jump up out of its trap. Okay, when it jumps up out of its trap, it is now free to fall back into the atom that it came from. Okay, so what happens when this book falls?
Kinetic energy.
Potential got converted into kinetic as the book was falling, and when the book hit the table, what happened? All of its kinetic energy got converted into sound waves, right? Okay. Book's held up, right? And in this case, to get the book back down to the tabletop, I would just let go of the book, right? But this guy is stuck here, okay? Laser beam comes in and now lets it loose out of its trap, lets this little electron loose out of its trap. It jumps back into its atom, the book begins to fall, okay? When it gets back to its atom, it's gonna have to release all of the energy that it was holding on to, all of the X-ray energy that it was holding on to from that exposure, okay? Now, where the book converts kinetic energy, its speed of falling, right, converts that into sound and heat and stuff like that, this electron will release visible light, okay? So it jumps back into its atom, releasing all of the energy that it had absorbed as visible light, okay? We then read the visible light. We use mirrors and fiber optics to read the visible light coming from that spot on the imaging plate, okay? Then the laser beam goes over to the next spot, shines at it, reads the light coming off of it, and then the next spot, and over and over and over again, just like the deck cells, rows at a time, okay?
It does the same thing for this.
It does the same thing, right? Each little, now instead of deck cells, right, instead of little tiny microscopic deck cells, you have atoms, okay? Tiny atoms. This is why you have better spatial resolution with CR, because effectively the detector elements are atoms, okay? And atoms are very, very small. So, good, laser beam comes in, shines at the plate, the electrons hop back out of their trap into the atoms they came from, releasing all of what they had held on to as a form of visible light. To be clear, it's blue-violet light. And we read in the processor the light coming off of the plate. Okay.
And the light exposed the X-ray.
We've already made
Exposed the image.
the light coming off of here will tell us what shade of gray
Or okay.
to give that spot on the plate.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Just one more time here. On the left is exposure. This is in the X-ray room. X-ray photon strikes the plate. Plate frees some electrons. They get trapped and held onto. Again, kind of like me holding this book up. All the energy's stuck now, right? Nothing's going to happen until I let this book go. Okay? The electron's stuck. Laser light shines at it. Electron now jumps back out of its hole. I drop the book. Okay? When the book hits the table, and when the electron gets back to its atom, it's going to let all that energy out. Okay? The electron lets it out as visible light. The book let it out as sound and heat.
And then that will form a shade of gray.
That light coming off will tell the computer what shade of gray. So if this guy got, if this part on the plate got no X-ray exposure because there was like a lead mat over it or something like that, right, or a metal piece of the body, right, then when the laser beam asks it, how much light are you going to give me, it's going to give it none, right?
Because it was blocked.
Because it was blocked. Nothing got, no energy got absorbed, right? But if it's like the background, like the black background on an image, right, that gets lots of exposure, well, when the laser beam shines at it, the light coming off is going to be much, much more, okay, giving us a darker shade of gray. So it's unlike DEC cells. DEC cells tell the computer what shade of gray by giving it an amount of electric current. These guys tell the computer what shade of gray by how much light is coming off of each spot on the plate. Okay, there are some unnecessary complications that we could get into that I won't, so I'm going to move forward. So let's describe a little bit about how the processor works, okay? Now, all of this that you're seeing here is done inside of like a closed off thing. You never ever see inside of the processor, okay? But it's useful to kind of get an idea about what's happening here. So let me zoom in a little bit. Allow me to go stand up here and point and shout. Okay. All right, so the plate is stuck into the processor. The cassette is stuck into the processor. The plate is drawn out into the processor. Rollers above and below the plate will suck the plate into the processor. Okay, this big parallelogram, which is supposed to be the plate, right? The rectangle goes into the processor. Okay, as the plate is drawn into the processor, a couple of other important pieces of equipment are at work. One, there's a laser source. Okay, laser beam. Now that laser beam doesn't shine directly at the plate for interesting reasons. That laser beam shines at a special mirror. That mirror can rotate, and that will allow the laser beam to scan left and right. Okay? Laser beam shines at a mirror. Mirror shines at another mirror. Okay? So we go laser beam to mirror. This mirror can move, directing the laser beam at a cylinder shape. I know it's not a cylinder in this picture, but at a cylinder shaped mirror that directs the laser light downward towards the plate. Okay? So what's important is that the green lines make their way down to the plate. Okay? And it's just reflecting, like literally a mirror. Okay? As the plate is brought in, the laser beam scans, let's say from left to right along one part of the plate, and asks each part of the plate, how much light are you going to give me? Okay? When it's over here, top left of the plate, it reads the amount of light coming off, scoots over a little bit, reads the amount of light coming off, scoots over a little bit, and again, and again, and again, and again. That area that it's checking is called sampling. We learned about sampling, right, in the first class. It's sampling the light coming off and then moving over to another spot, sampling the light, moving over again, sampling, across a whole row. Then the plate moves in again, tiny little bit, okay? Then it samples the next row. Then it scoots in again, samples the row after that. This happens kind of fast, but it samples row by row by row along the entire plate as the plate is drawn in, okay? Each of those rows, when sampled, each spot when sampled, will emit some light. The computer knows where the laser is at on the plate, where it's sampling, okay? When the laser hits the plate at the spot that it's sampling, light's gonna come out, and that light will be captured by fiber optic cables, okay? Fiber optic cables, kind of shown here, is this big like fanning out thing. These fiber optic cables will capture the light and direct that light being emitted towards something called a photomultiplier tube. Photo for light, multiplier for making more of it. Okay, so it's an amplification device. Okay, it's tiny amounts of light coming off of here, so the photomultiplier amplifies the light signal. It uses electric current to beef up the light signal a little bit. Okay, so the light comes off the plate toward photomultiplier tube. The photomultiplier tube spits out the light towards here to something called an analog to digital converter. The analog to digital converter just takes the analog light information and turns that into computer usable information. Okay, we don't need to go much more complicated than that, but turns it into computer usable information. Okay, that's what we talked about last time about like converting into discrete values, right? Discrete shades of gray. So there, I mean, it looks a little complicated, and it kind of can be. It took me a while to sort of get a feel for this, right? To be able to stand up here and try to explain it the best I can. But I think it's not that bad, right? There's a plate on some rollers. There's a laser source, a couple of mirrors, right? Laser scans the plate. Light comes off the plate. We capture the light and send that light to a computer. We need two things to send it to the computer: photomultiplier tube to beef up the signal, and an analog to digital converter so the computer can understand the signal. Okay. A couple of complications that are useful and important, and you should know the terms. There's two terms, fast scan and slow scan. And when no one took the time to help me learn these when I was a student, so I just thought fast scan was like the fast version and slow scan was the slow version. Nothing to do with that, okay? These are the directions in which the laser is scanning or the direction in which the plate is moving, okay? As the plate is drawn into the processor, the laser scans, let's say left to right across the plate. We call that the fast scan direction. It's just describing the laser beam sweeping across the plate, sampling the plate. Slow scan just means the direction the plate's moving. So these don't actually mean fast versus slow, okay? It's just for needlessly complicated ways to say fast scan is the laser beam scans across the plate, okay? And as the laser beam scans across the plate moves into the processor. Slow scan. Don't ask me why they got named fast scan and slow scan. I'm sure an engineer could go, oh yeah, it's for this reason. I don't know. It doesn't matter though either, right? You just got to remember the term, okay? All right, so there's fast scan versus slow scan. So the direction the plate moves, we call that slow scan or sub scan. The direction the laser scans, we refer to that as fast scan. Okay. I think I did a good job of explaining the rest of that. Yes, good there, good there, good there. Okay, let's talk about a couple important things. So the phosphor plate can store X-ray energy, release it later on, minutes later usually, like or seconds later, right? Because you just grab it and go to the processor. Release that energy later as visible light. The computer can read that visible light and build up an image based on that, okay? After scanning though, and this is important, the plate after being scanned by the laser isn't fully erased, okay? The plate will hang on to, this is by the way how I knew my processor was going bad. The plate will hang on to a little bit of that energy that was stored, okay? If it's not erased, that plate, the next time you take an X-ray, will have a leftover ghost image of what you just took a picture of, your previous radiograph, okay? And you're looking at, what is happening? Like, I see the thing I want to see, but then like there's all this extra stuff around it that has nothing to do with what I'm looking at. It's a ghost image. In order for the plate to be fully erased and reused again, it has to be moved in the sub-scan direction, so pushed back out. And as it's pushed back out, an additional special light that's in this time bright white, super white LED light, basically takes and lets the plate release anything that was left over. Okay, it stimulates the plate to release any stored leftover energy that it had clung on to. Okay, this clean plate is then stuffed back into the cassette by the processor, and then is released by the processor for retrieval by you, the X-ray tech. You'll hear the plate, when you stick it into the processor, you'll hear the processor clamp down and lock the plate in. And then when it's all done scanning, the processor will unclamp and release the plate for you, and you can take it out. Okay? Properly erased CR phosphor plates can be reused thousands of times. Okay. Each exposure made on the plate must be identified with the appropriate patient information before the image is read by the processor. In other words, you have to tell the processor, hey, this is an x-ray of this patient that I have the order for, right? What you're doing is you look at your order, click on it, open it, tell the computer, hey, I'm about to process the image, right? And then it brings that image up under that patient's information. With film, we used to have an ID that was flashed onto the film that was the patient's information, name, date of birth, date of exam, all that stuff, and it was actually attached to the film. Most of mine have been clipped off because we're supposed to, like for HIPAA law, not supposed to have patient information flying around. But you'll see like, does this one have it? Oh yeah, this one still has it. Check that out. Right there, top corner, right? There's all the patient's information there, okay? This was flashed onto the plate, and is permanent on here. The CR plates don't have that, okay? So you have to open the patient's file in the computer, then scan the plate, and the image is stored in the patient's file after that point, okay? You could accidentally take an x-ray on somebody, open up the wrong patient file, and store the wrong x-ray in the wrong patient file, okay? So there's a little bit of extra complication, whereas this, it's like, as long as you put the right patient's name onto here, you're good to go. This is always attached to it. In the same way, once you open up the file, process the image, is brought up under that patient's name, then that image is always attached to that patient. Let's talk a little bit about background radiation and scatter radiation. Our next module is not physics, radiation safety. Okay, it is one of two of my favorite modules. It really is a fun one. It's short as far as the chapters to read, but it's very, very expansive as far as the information we're going to cover, okay? One of the topics that we cover in radiation safety, one of the first things we cover, is called background radiation. I mentioned it already today. It's what you are always exposed to, no matter what you do, no matter where you go, okay? If you are alive on Earth, or actually anywhere else in the universe, you are exposed to background radiation all the time, okay? Now, our Earth is pretty nice to us and helps us a little bit. We've got magnetic fields and such that keep us from being, cooked by the sun, right? But we're exposed to radiation. That's called your background, okay? There's natural background, there's man-made background radiation. This is kind of interesting. The glossy cover on your books and magazines and stuff? It's radioactive, a little bit, tiny bit. It comes from clays and things like that are rich in uranium, and so there's tiny amounts of radioactivity. You can't really measure it. It's the amount of radiation coming off of these glossy materials is lower than the background radiation in the room. So if I turned on a Geiger counter, it couldn't measure it, but it's there, right? Background is all around you, okay? So if you can't avoid the background, we have to understand that how it affects our image receptors, okay? For one, DR, what we talked about first, is not sensitive to background radiation, okay? But CR is potentially sensitive to background radiation, okay? CR is also sensitive to scattered radiation. Scattered radiation is not as hard as it might seem. It just, when x-rays hit the patient, x-rays scatter in all directions, okay? It's kind of like if you took a water hose and turned it on full blast and pointed it at the wall, what's going to happen? Water's going to spray everywhere, right? Why? because energy is conserved, right? And the water hit the wall and something's got to happen, right? It's not just going to like disappear, right? The water's going to spray everywhere, right? The faster that water goes, the further that water is going to spray, right? Some of it, you point it straight at the wall, some of it's going to spray right back at you, right? Some of it's going to spray off to the side, right? Some of it's going to go down to the ground. It scatters, in other words, okay? Can you like accurately predict exactly where the water is going to scatter? No, not really. You can kind of have an idea though, right? If I point it directly at the wall, I'm gonna get more scattering. You ever like do the dishes and get sprayed in the face, right? Like spoons and bowls and stuff. You spray the water and like it like loops around the bowl and sprays you right back in the face, right? So you're kind of smart about it. Like you tilt the bowl away from you when you're doing it. You spray it. It sprays at your backsplash, right? So you can kind of like get an idea of where water is gonna scatter to, right? You can also kind of get an idea of like where radiation is gonna scatter as well. Okay, you can't predict it exactly, but you know sort of where it's gonna go. Okay, kind of like where you know the water is gonna spray when you're doing your dishes. Scatter's going to happen, okay? These cassettes are sensitive to scatter radiation. They're sensitive to the background radiation in the room. CR plates are approximately 10 times more sensitive to scatter and background than conventional film is. Now, when a plate is erased and then immediately reused, there's just no time for it to store or to be exposed to scatter or background, okay? But if a plate is left in the x-ray room on accident, okay, or is just left unused for, let's say, days or weeks at a time, okay, because you're using the other plates for some reason, not this one, they will accumulate exposure due to background and scatter, okay? And what this takes the form of on the plate, it takes the form of fog on the imaging plate. I'll show some pictures on the next slide. It takes the form of fog. And just so you can have a number if you'd like it, typical background exposures are about 70 to 80 micro Röntgen per day. You don't know what a Röntgen is yet, but you will. It takes only about 100 micro Röntgen to produce fog density on the plate. So 70 to 80 micro Röntgen per day, takes 100 micro Röntgen to produce fog. A couple of days without using the plate has passed the threshold for seeing fog on the plate, okay? So like you close on Friday at 5, right? Come in on Monday at 9, right? You're gonna get your plates. The first image that you take, if you don't erase them before that, if you don't erase the plates before using them, they may have some fog on them, okay? It's a little bit, it's not gonna really mess things up too much, but it's there, okay? So we have to and continue to have to be conscious of that when we make an exposure on the first day after the weekend, okay? Or if we accidentally leave the plates in the x-ray room and they're exposed to scattered radiation. If you don't know, you will. The x-ray rooms have lead on all 4 walls, okay? Preventing radiation from like really getting out of the room, right? So where you stand to make the exposure is on the other side of a protective lead barrier, okay? So, and your plates are usually kept out there with you. But if you accidentally left the plates in the x-ray room for some reason, and then tried to use them, you would find that they were already fogged a little bit, already darkened a little bit from scatter exposure. The same way that they'll be darkened from background exposure if they're left for a couple of days without being used and erased. Every time you erase them, they're erased, and they will pretty much immediately begin to accumulate background radiation exposure because they're just very sensitive to it. Radiographers should be careful to erase any cassettes prior to use if there is any chance that it has been in storage for 2 days or more. So over the weekend, right? So, all right, let's look at a couple examples. An unused, unexposed, brand new, like if you erased a plate and then immediately tried to process it, it'll be bright white, okay? Plate A was placed behind the control booth during exposure. Plate A is an example of basically bright white, okay? Unexposed plate. It's in the control booth where the x-ray tech lives, okay? And we receive nearly no radiation, so the plate receives nearly no radiation. But it shows white. I don't know how easy it is to see. It's okay-ish on the screen, but you have these in your textbook too. And they were also sent to you, so if you're bringing these up on your tablet or computer, you can probably see these better than the TV screen. Plate B was stored for 2 days without erasing And notice it's a little bit darker than plate A. Plate C was set 2 meters from an abdomen phantom during an exposure. So plate B was like, I'm standing in the room during the exposure, which we don't do, okay? And plate B, sorry, plate C, excuse me. Plate C is the darkest, okay? So plate A is like normal plates are, tiny a little bit, almost nothing, right? Nearly no detectable exposure. They say shows something, but it's nearly nothing. Plate B, 2 days without erasing, a little darker. And plate C was exposed to scatter radiation. So it's a lot darker. 6 feet from the patient. All right. So this is supposed to show you that the plates are sensitive to the background radiation in the room, as well as scattered radiation in the X-ray suite on the other side of that lead barrier. So if your plates are stored over a couple of days, erase them before using them. There is an erase function on your processor that you do not have to process the plate to use. You stick the plate in, press erase, it just erases it, draws the plate in, erases it, and sticks it back without trying to process an image. If it's got left over the weekend, erase it. If it accidentally got left in the room, also erase it. Okay? If you're ever unsure if a plate is ready to use, erase it. It's really easy to do. Oh my goodness. Okay. We have to